So, ladies and jelly spoons. Oh, how are you, my friend? Welcome back. Okay, how are you doing? I'm glad. I treated myself to a nice movie. Have you seen a movie called Good Will Hunting? Have you seen Good Will Hunting? Have you seen Good Will Hunting? Good Will Hunting? Good. We're going to talk a little bit related to that today. But the first things first, how many of you got an email from me today? 3 of you? Okay, good. Yeah, within about 24 hours, I'll be done with all the grading. And yeah, so that's that. And the second assignment is now available. Guys, all the assignments are going to be same format. I've adjusted a few things on the assignments, so let's get into that right now, because let's go through this second assignment. We'll always go through the assignment so everything is clear. So this second assignment is what we're talking about now. We're still on metaphysics, but now we're not looking at God. Now we're looking at the mind-body problem. And you know, most of these directions are the same. Must be 3 to 4 pages double spaced. Now, here's something different. I changed this. I didn't specify this before, so pay attention. Must be submitted in Microsoft Word. Now, I'm only doing this because I like commenting at the bottom of your, what you write. And if you do a PDF, I can't do that. I have to go to your email and do that. I know it's some minor thing, but I really would like you to have your comments in the document. You see why? Okay. Paper essay due on October 12th. So you have 14 days, just like last time. I'll always try and make it 14 days. Is that enough time? Submit it by email to my email address at that. So yeah, no one had any problem. Everybody used the right email, but I'm just putting it there just in case, so that you don't have to look up the email. It'll be right there in the assignment. You know what I mean? Okay. All right, just gonna repeat. This is worth 25% of your total grade. There are 5 questions, and each question is worth 5% of the 25% that makes up your grade for this assignment. All right, guys, let's get into it. Questions. Is there no way to tell whether you're being deceived by an evil demon, or living inside the matrix, or playing an advanced virtual reality game? So you have to say yes or no there. I'll give you 5 points to say yes or no. Then number 2, if you think that you know that none of these things are true, how do you know? All right, so this is a bit of epistemology. What? Sorry, what? Maybe something I'm doing. If I was over there, maybe something I'm doing. All right. All right, so guys, you can see why number 2 is epistemology, right? You see why? Because it's asking how would you know, right? All right, number 3, what distinguishes real experiences from artificial ones? You can see why that's related to the matrix problem, right? If you're saying you can tell that you're not in the matrix, if you're saying right now you can tell that you're not in the matrix, that raises a broader issue. How do you know you're not in a computer simulation at all? What is it? Is it the way it looks? Because I remember back when video games were really early, right? Like before Street Fighter and earlier, video games were kind of granular. You could tell the characters were cartoonish, right? Now, maybe you could have used something like that. You could have said, well, artificial experiences are all kind of low resolution or something. But now I don't think you could say that. Now I think our CGI is sophisticated enough, we could create pretty real experiences. And so in theory, you might not be able to distinguish real experiences from artificial ones, where someone has maybe just plugged your brain into certain wires or whatever, and is stimulating your neurons directly, you know? That's how Neo was, right? In the Matrix, he had wires coming directly out of his brain. All right, number 4, if you think you can't know that your experience is not artificial, do you think you can know anything about the external world? Remember, guys, this goes back to Descartes, right? Descartes was stuck with the question, hey, after I reinvent myself and I get rid of all my old beliefs and I have this new foundation is I exist. And the further refinement of that is, I think, therefore I am. So there's a condition for me existing. And the condition is not my body, the condition is my mind or my soul. But there's a problem with that. The activities that go on that represent your soul, they create a world, kind of like the world you had before, but this time it's utterly subjective. It's a world that exists internally. It's an internal world, an inner world, where all the things in your world are no longer objects, but they're now ideas in your mind. And now you have a burden. You have an epistemological burden. How do you know that there's a world outside of this inner world full of ideas? How do you know that? So that's what I'm asking you here. If you think you can't know that your experience is not artificial, then do you think you can know anything about the external world? That is, if we start with utter subjectivity, if we start with an almost absolute subjectivity, is there any escape route? Can you find any way that you can peer behind the veil and discover an external world? Or is it hopeless? No matter where you go, you also bring your subjectivity with you. You see that? That's the burden. All right, and if you think so, if so, how? Tell me a little story about how you think you can prove there's an external world. Guys, this is very important because it's related to what I was telling you about the difference between science and philosophy. I hope you realize now, starting in high school when you study physics, chemistry, and biology, all the way till when you study it in undergrad and beyond, this is a question that scientists do not typically ask themselves. Yet it's the foundation for what they do. Because remember, if you're in a lab and you've designed this experiment and you're following the scientific method, let me put it to you this way. If you are in a dream and you do an experiment in a dream, do the results of your experiment hold? You can see where I'm going with this, right? Let's say you have a dream tonight or last night, and in the dream you do an experiment. Are those results valid? No, they were in a dream. So the same thing applies in this dream. If you are trapped in an inner world, if you're trapped in an internal world, and you do an experiment in an internal world, well then, what does that experiment of yours say about the external world? All you're doing is you're saying, hey, I'm in a dream where I can do experiments. You see that? If scientists don't ask themselves about objectivity and the possibility of an external world, well, I mean, they're just, yeah, they're dreaming on, That's their dream. They're living their dream. They're scientists. They're asking some intelligent questions, but I would argue that philosophy holds on to even more fundamental questions, and they're the kind of questions that you can't answer using an experiment, and they're the kind of questions that recur each generation. So that gives philosophy a noble status. Just like I told you, the poet talks about the typical experiences and facts that recur generation after generation. That's what makes the Yahwist a great poet for, let's say, the Torah. That's what makes Shakespeare immortal, right? Because he's not talking about his own private, peculiar experiences. He's talking about what all human beings under certain conditions experience. That's what makes Hamlet immortal. Macbeth, King Lear, and of course Othello. So what I'm suggesting to you is that universality of the human experience and the human condition, poets can see it, religions can definitely see it, and I'm saying philosophers can also see it. The idea that life is a dream is something that every human being probably has experienced at one point in his life, cross-culturally and throughout history. So that gives philosophy a noble status to constantly remind us that we're taking a lot for granted when we think we've figured stuff out, but we haven't even addressed the problem of whether or not we're in a matrix or a dream. Do you see that? Okay. Are there any questions about this? Do you understand all the language? Do you understand what you're up to in this assignment? Well, you can email me later if you have questions. So that's it, guys. And that's how the other two assignments are going to be. No. Remember, I want to emphasize, I have no idea what the answer to this is. And I don't expect you to think that you know either. But you can have an opinion, and you can sophisticate your opinion using some of the things we've thought about, and I will reward you handsomely for doing that. Okay? All right, so let's move on. So we're gonna make a little time for inspiration. The goal for today, guys, is to do a little bit of inspiration, to talk about what I wanted you to read for today. It's very short. Did anyone read it? It was really short, right? What you had to read for today was only 2 pages, right? Yeah, 3 pages. But it's a deep problem, so we're gonna get to it. So I want us to go through a little bit of inspiration and then go through this reading for today, and then maybe try to give an overview of the entire landscape of the mind-body problem and all the positions you can take and the problems with all the positions. But if we don't get through it today, it's fine. We can spend all next class doing that. So there's no rush. Sound good? All right, good. So I asked you about Good Will Hunting. There was an African-American poet. Her name was Gwendolyn Brooks. And she wrote a poem that I think was very philosophical. And if you've seen Good Will Hunting and you read this poem, I think that you will have a deeper appreciation not only for what philosophy is, but also the relationship between philosophy and other sectors of culture, like, for example, poetry and philosophy. All right? So let's get into it. This is a poem by Gwendolyn Brooks called Sadie and Maud. Now, I would like one of you to volunteer, read it very loudly, and read it till the very end. That's the entirety of it. But we're gonna analyze it and get philosophical about it. So any volunteers to read loudly till the very end? Great.
Maud went to college, Sadie stayed at home. Sadie's straight line. With the fine tooth comb. She didn't leave with tangle in. Her comb found every strand. Sadie was one of the chits in all the land. Sadie bore 2 babies under her maiden name. Maud and Papa nearly died of shame. When Sadie said her life so long, her girls struck out and moaned. Sadie had left as heritage
When philosophy was born in ancient Greece, a lot of the earliest philosophers were very poetic, and they left us poems rather than books or papers or articles. And you can see this poetry throughout the history of philosophy. It's really a remarkable feature that a lot of the best philosophers, in addition to being great mathematicians, great scientists, and many of them were also very religious, I'm just letting you know that a lot of them were also very, very good poets. And they expressed themselves using poetry. But Gwendolyn Brooks is not an academic or professional philosopher at all, and nor do I think was the director of Good Will Hunting. Yet I want to suggest to you that properly understood, these things like Good Will Hunting and Sadie and Maud right here are super philosophical. If you just take the effort to really digest them and to recognize how wholesome and nutritious they are. But for that, we need to get into a bit of analysis. So let's analyze this poem and its relationship to Good Will Hunting and its relationship to some earlier things we were talking about, especially when we talked about how philosophy can help us be woke. So what is it to be woke in this context? So Maud went to college, right? Sadie stayed at home. What do you think that contrast means? Maud went to college, Sadie stayed at home. What is the poet already introducing there? Inequality, very good. And it's a particular kind of inequality. It's probably financial inequality, right? And class inequality, right? Do you think when Maud went to college, do you think she's going to be in the same class after she goes to college as Sadie? Same socioeconomic class? Probably not, right? So Maud went to college, Sadie stayed at home. Also, with that difference in social class and financial status, you're going to have a bit of a stigma maybe, right? Right? You're not college educated. You see that? You're not part of the educated class. So Maud went to college, Sadie stayed at home. All right, now this gets interesting. Sadie scraped life with a fine-tooth comb. That line right there is probably deeper than anything I've said in this course so far. So I needed to digest it properly. What is she talking about there? I mean, you're scraping life with a fine-tooth comb? How is that even possible? I'm assuming that because Gwendolyn Brooks is African American, she is using a reference from her own experiences as an African American. So she probably has nappy hair, right? So Maud went to college, Sadie stayed at home. Sadie scraped life with a fine-tooth comb. So the fine-tooth comb, to give it context, if you have hair like mine or you're African American, you can't use a regular brush, you know what I mean? You gotta use a comb. And you need a fine tooth comb because you want to get rid of the curls and straighten it a little bit, right? Okay, so what does it mean to scrape life with the fine tooth comb? There's a deeper hint in the next line. So, Sadie scraped life with a fine-tooth comb. She didn't leave a tangle in. She didn't leave a tangle in. Her comb found every strand. She was one of the livingest chits in all the land. Now take that as a whole. There's this one person who went to college. The only thing we can speculate about this person who went to college is that they're probably well off financially and well respected, right? But we don't know yet what happened to them. Then we have this other person who didn't go to college, probably is a bit stigmatized, looked down at, but there's a certain activity going on with this person who didn't go to college. She's scraping life with a fine-tooth comb. She's not leaving any tangles in. Her comb is finding every strand, and she's living life to the fullest. You see that? That's what it means to be one of the livingest chicks in all the land. He's living life to the fullest. Can you see why this is related to Good Will Hunting? How does Good Will Hunting end? What's the last scene? It's been a while. Go ahead. The professor who was in love with him was in love with one part of him, his mind, his intellect, right? And he's like, how can we let someone like this go to waste? He's brilliant. He needs to be in college. He needs to get a degree. He needs to become more respectable. And he needs to make a contribution to human knowledge and become like us, an esteemed professor full of honors. And he had an interview before he got on the road. He had an interview set up, right? But what did he choose? Did he choose the interview or to go to Stanford? Go ahead.
To Stanford with his girlfriend.
Right. He's going to Stanford not so that he can study there. He's going, why? Say it again.
Because his girlfriend is, I think, going to med school.
She didn't leave a tangle in. Her comb found every strand. Remember in Good Will Hunting, there's a couple of activities that Will is very interested in doing all the time. One of them is fighting a lot. And even when he's not fighting, he's very confrontational, right? He's getting into altercations with people and showing off his knowledge. I guess the fighting might be interpreted as one kind of living life to the fullest. He's drinking, he's, fighting, he's got his knowledge aspect. He's a janitor, right, in the movie? And it's true that he hasn't reached his full potential as an academic, and maybe not even as a human being. But the question is, what is it to live life to the fullest? Is it to accumulate the types of things that make you respectable? Is that living life to the fullest? Or is it to live every moment as intensely as possible, regardless of what that means? Is the very intensity of the moment you're living the ultimate justification for your life? Do you remember the branch of philosophy we talked about that involves you valuing your life? There's axiology, which is beauty and goodness of actions and persons. But what about that branch that has to do with the beauty and goodness and value of life itself? Do you remember? Existentialism. We're going to get to that. That's going to be our last class, basically, on existentialism. But what I'm doing with this is I'm trying to suggest to you that if philosophy is just about accumulating more and more degrees and getting more and more honors and accolades and people referencing you and media and stuff like that, that might not be exactly living life to the fullest. You see what I'm saying? Maybe living life to the fullest is something less shiny, less respectable. Maybe it means things that we stigmatize, things like aggression. Maybe aggression is living life to the fullest, like Will was. I'm not saying that we should go out and fight and kill each other. I'm just trying to put things into perspective of when you talk about living life to the fullest and living a life that's truly worth living, we have resources in our culture, like film and poetry, that can suggest to us ways that we can affirm life and live life to the fullest that might not look like what we've been socialized to believe. So I agree that Will was not living up to his full potential as an academic and as a respectable person, but there's something even worse than that. He also wasn't living up to his full potential in terms of living life as fully and intensely as possible. And that's where I think that the psychologist, the therapist comes in. Because Robin Williams points out to Will that you think you are living life to the fullest because you're really witty and you've read a lot. But you remember the scene where they're sitting in front of, I guess it's a pond or a lake? Do you remember that? He anticipates what Will would say. He says, yeah, if I talk about love, you're going to quote Shakespeare. If I talk about war, you're going to quote World War II history. But that's not living. That's just academic, encyclopedic knowledge. You don't know, you said something very important. You don't know what it is to lose something, because you can only lose something when you care about something more than you care about yourself. So do you see room for growth there for Will? All right, now let's come back to this. So do you have a better understanding of what we mean by scraping life with a fine-tooth comb? It might not be very glamorous. It might mean being a janitor for a few years. It might mean having a love affair or two that will educate you about what life is all really about. Might mean turning down an interview, but pursuing something you're really passionate about, which is another person. You see that? All right. So Sadie bore 2 babies under her maiden name. Now, what is that saying? She bore 2 babies under her maiden name. We've talked about how thinking is about implication. That line is implying something. She bore 2 babies under her maiden name. What does that mean? Out of wedlock. So do you see what I was talking about, the respectability? She's not respectable. But do you think her life is worth living? Something to think about. Maud and Ma and Pa nearly died of shame. Now that's clear, right? She is not respectable. She's stigmatized. When Sadie said her last so long, her girl struck out from home. Sadie had left as heritage her fine-tooth comb. So there are 2 legacies there. One, she actually gave birth, right? And 2, she gave them a code to life. She gave them a way of decoding life and living it to the fullest. Because she left as heritage her fine-tooth comb, the same fine-tooth comb that she used to live to the fullest. And then let's look at the last one. Maud, who went to college, is a thin brown mouse. She is living all alone in this old house. What do you think that's saying? She did not get married, right? She did not get married. She probably has no children, living all alone. No children, no marriage. What about the legacy? No fine-tooth comb. So the fine-tooth comb is, guys, is supposed to show you that someone was living at very high resolution. In other words, life is rich in meaning and complexity, but if you only approach it using a blunt instrument, like maybe what your textbooks tell you or what you consider respectable, you'll leave out a lot that's very important. But Will, at the end of Good Will Hunting, he's woke. But he's not woke in the way that we consider respectable. Do you see that? If we wanted to understand respectable woke, then he should have gone to get some degrees and get a respectable job and move to the suburbs. You know, that would be respectable woke. But he's woke in a very different way. He's woke in the same way that Sadie is. Do you see that? Okay, that's enough of that, guys. I just wanted to show you that the distribution of wisdom and the distribution of philosophy is not necessarily always in the textbooks we use. I think philosophy is all around you. Your elders can tell you a lot of philosophy and wisdom. Film can tell you wisdom. Poetry is full of wisdom. So there's no use being snobbish or elitist or arrogant as a philosopher. The best thing a philosopher can do is give you something wholesome and nutritious, something that's gonna give you spiritual nutrients and wake you up and keep you healthy and alive. But what that looks like might be very different than what's respectable. That's all I'm saying. It might. It might also look very respectable. It just depends on how you manage your environment. All right. Good. Any questions? So we do some philosophy. All right. You should watch Good Will Hunting if you haven't seen it. It's a really good movie. All right. Now, what I had you read for today was very short, but very dense, and it walks through a problem that I summarized very briefly last time, but let's build it up. If you are a dualist like Descartes is, that means you're committed to the idea that there are two different things out there in the world. But these things have a special metaphysical status. There are two realities that exist in the world. And the name we give to these two realities is substances. There are two substances in the world, and these two substances have two different properties. Well, not two different properties. They have many different properties, but the reason we call them substances is because they are different from their properties. They persist through all the changes of their properties. You see that? One of these substances Descartes calls mind. The other substance he calls matter or body. Now, to be a dualist is to say there are two realities, two substances, and all appearances are different changes in these two substances. Now, I said he's a qualified dualist. He is a dualist, but one of these substances ranks higher than the other. The mind or the soul substance ranks higher than the body substance because even though we are both of those things, we are more essentially one of them than the other. Do you remember which one we are more essentially? Well, one of these substances more essentially than we are the other one, yeah? Yeah, very good. We're more essentially mind. So, just to walk you through it briefly, remember with something like an object like this, naive common sense tells us that this object is a real objective thing. It's something in front of me, and its very status as something that has a distance in front of me is supposed to suggest that maybe it has an independent existence from me, right? But after you walk through Descartes' second meditation towards the end, he says, on the contrary, if you really think about this object rather than looking at it, you'll realize that you actually know your own mind better than you know this object. And the status of this object actually confirms the existence of your mind more than it confirms its own existence. Can anyone walk us through that reasoning? How can it be that this object in front of me, if properly understood, actually gives more evidence of the nature of my mind and myself than it gives evidence for itself? How can that be? What was Descartes' logic? Because this is related very, very much to the problem we're about to get into, which is called the problem of other minds. How come you can turn and look at your classmate, and according to Descartes, the appearance of your classmate, their body, is more evidence of your own mind than it is of them? How can that be? That sounds like an inverted world. But that's exactly what he talks about when he talks about the wax. Remember we talked about wax? Go ahead.
It's because you like to see something, and that's you being subjective about it.
Mhm.
You have a mind.
Exactly, very good. That's you being subjective about it. Whenever you think you have an object in front of you, that's because you've temporarily forgotten that its technical status in your field of vision is an idea. And it is relative to you. So it's subjective. And like I said, subjectivity is something you can't escape, especially in the modern world. So what that means is all the properties that this thing has, they are all properties, not of the thing, but of your subjectivity. Its color, its shape, its size, those are all features of your own subjectivity and your own mind. Your mind is very different from this thing metaphysically, because this thing metaphysically is physical. It has physical nature. It is nothing but matter. Descartes does believe matter exists, by the way. Somehow, in the sixth meditation, he's going to escape his own subjectivity using reason alone. And he's going to argue that matter exists. But still, we're more essentially soul and mind than we are matter, okay? But the thing is, this thing right here, all of that shape and size and color are properties of the idea that's within my field of vision, not of the object. We don't have access to the object. We only have access to the idea. And that idea has certain properties. And when those properties are consistently grouped together, no matter where I put this idea, then we get the illusion that, oh yeah, since the consistency is maintained and conserved, no matter where I look at it, then you get this idea of independence. Do you see that? You get the illusion that, well, how could this group of ideas be consistently moving with the same idea, complex idea, if there were no substance that they were actually sticking on or holding on? You see that? So we have this idea of a substance that we can't actually validate or see. And that is the problem of other minds, guys, because look around you. What do you technically see? You see ideas in your own mind, right? Your classmates right here, their bodies are not independent things. They're dependent on you, your subjectivity. They have a status as ideas in your field of vision. All that color, all that shape, all that size are features of your activity, the activity of your mind. They are your perceptions. Is this making sense? This is Cartesian reasoning, classical Cartesian reasoning. Okay, so it generates the problem of other minds. How? Guys, science only believes in things that are visible, apparent, right? So this creates a problem. If science is true or correct, then when I look at you, all I have access to are your body and its parts, and that's it. I never get anything else. I can't see a mental state by opening up your skull. I'm never going to find a belief. I'm never going to find a desire. I'm never going to find a thought or a feeling. You get the idea? Every time I dissect you, I'm just going to go further and further and further into more and more ideas. Some of them are going to be complex ideas like this, and others are going to be simple ideas like pure blood, like the color of blood, red. But the bottom line is you never escape your subjectivity. So as you approach another person, what are you going to encounter? More and more of your own subjectivity, which creates the problem of other minds. You're like, holy, are you kidding me right now? Bro, everywhere I go, my own subjectivity is conserved. This is a problem. Because if everywhere you go, your own subjectivity is conserved as an absolute law, the law of conservation of subjectivity. Jesus Christ, that means you're the only mind that you've ever known, and you're the only mind that you ever will know. That position in philosophy is called solipsism. It comes from the Latin solus ipse, only me, or only I. And this is a problem, guys. The possibility that you will never encounter another mind. You're the only mind that exists. Now do you see why people care about the problem of other minds and demonstrating it? It creates an existential threat. Is life worth living if you're the only mind? We tend to love things like empathy and compassion and companionship because we feel like we're actually communing with other people in a community. But if we have to give up a staple food like companionship because the person sitting next to me is either a zombie or some sort of dream illusion or I know not what, je ne sais quoi, what are we talking about here? Go ahead.
This isn't exactly philosophic, but if you just believe that it is companionship, there are other people with minds, isn't that kind of the same effect as if you never doubted the problem of other minds in the first place?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that they're equivalent. Yeah, a lot of people.
Like what if you just said, why do we care? Let's just pretend like it's real because we all just want to kill ourselves and we didn't.
I think we can imagine that the people walking around who haven't done philosophy, yeah, I think they're exactly right. They're healthy, like you said. They're healthy. They aren't being haunted by skepticism about the existence of other minds. They're not. I'm sorry, guys. I didn't mean to do. Lo siento, pobrecito. I didn't mean. I'm sorry. Don't cancel me, please. I know cancel culture is a big thing. He told us that we were the only minds. Oh, God. I'm just trying to motivate you to appreciate the problem, that's all. So Bertrand Russell wrote this whole thing, and it's called The Argument from Analogy for Other Minds. That's what I had you read. So I just gave you some background for that. So let's spend the next 30 minutes really getting into that. That'll be food enough for today. So, just like Descartes has to figure out a way to pierce the veil of subjectivity and get outside it to see what's really out there, right? Reality, metaphysics. How are we going to get past this membrane, this barrier, which is your own subjectivity? How can you transcend that to see reality? Well, that's Descartes' problem, right? I live in an inner world and I'm trapped in it and I can't get out. So that has two consequences. One, it means that maybe what's really real, maybe metaphysics, is actually inner. What's truly real, what's really real, maybe it isn't out there, maybe it's me. And some philosophers have taken that to a really high level. There was a philosopher called Fichte, and he was a German philosopher between two really big titans, Kant and Hegel. In between, we have Fichte. We're not going to get into Kant in this class, but the bottom line is, if you look at the history of German philosophy, it was very much influenced by Descartes. But while Descartes felt uncomfortable with all this solipsism and this idealism, the idea that he's the only mind, Fichte embraced it. He says, yes, reality is subjective. And he tried to figure out how all this stuff, all of these phenomena, could be consequences, logical consequences of my own ego, my own self, my own solipsism. And he made a heroic effort, and that's that. I won't get into it, but go look on Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy or the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, even Wikipedia. If you're interested in that, you can get into it. The bottom line is what I'm trying to suggest to you is that these efforts to escape subjectivity, one of the big projects that presents itself is trying to know reality not as configured by my own mind, but reality as it, quote unquote, is in itself, out there, somewhere external to me, independent of me, objectively. I want to study that reality, not this reality that I've fabricated using my mind. So that's part of the big project that emerges after Descartes. But the other big part of the project that emerges is other minds. Because one part of that external reality is other minds, right? How can I determine that other people have minds? Now, this is a challenge because despite what Descartes said about the mind and things like that, how would you ever refute materialism? If a materialist says all that exists is just matter and atoms and metals and nonmetals and metalloids and gravity and electromagnetism and strong force and weak nuclear force, and, you know, they've got all these nice little charts and periodic tables and taxonomies. So how would you counter that? Because if you are looking at something and you can count it and systematize it and categorize it, and you feel that you have a representation of reality in something like a periodic table or something like that, now, all this mind talk, how would you even counter what the materialist is saying? Because remember, your subjectivity is conserved. So anything you dissect, whether it's a person, a tree, a rock or a stone, some geology, whatever you dissect, all the appearances that you find in that new specimen that you've dissected, all of those are going to erupt into your own subjectivity. So a materialist is always going to say, look, everywhere you look, all you find is atoms and a void and these fundamental forces. From an external point of view, guys, I think Bertrand Russell is right. Like, you can't refute materialism. Because your subjectivity configures everything as if it is an idea in your own mind. But what does the materialist do? The materialist comes along and convinces you that these ideas are not just ideas, but they are actually objects in the external world. But what's the problem with that? Okay, so if the person next to you is nothing but a complex arrangement of atoms or small fundamental particles in space, guess what that means now? Yeah, your subjectivity isn't conserved. Now we have some objectivity, but you have the same problem of other minds. Why? Because even if the materialist is right, and there are nothing but fundamental units of matter arranged in complex arrangements that make up our bodies, well, guess what? When you dissect that, what are you going to get? The same thing, right? Your subjectivity is going to be conserved, so all you're going to see are certain ideas, blah, blah, blah. You're never going to see your neighbor's thoughts, feelings, beliefs. You see what I'm saying? So Descartes is prejudiced. He's an idealist in a certain sense. And we can say, fine, so that's what explains why his subjectivity is conserved. But don't get distracted by the subjectivity. Let's assume objectivity is true. Let's say Descartes is wrong. So the materialist comes along and says, objectivity is true. What I see is what's real. That's called realism, right? What I see is real. So if I see certain patterns of matter, then they're not just ideas in my mind, they're independent of me and they're real. But guess what about those minds, guys? Do you see how the problem of minds is conserved, even for the materialist? Because once again, the materialist comes snooping around looking for a belief or a desire or a thought or a feeling. He isn't going to find one. The only person whose thoughts and feelings and beliefs and desires the materialist knows are his own. Because he's the only one who has his own subjectivity. He cannot have anyone else's subjectivity. That's why it's called subjectivity. To have subjectivity is to have things only relative to you, in relation to you. And the materialist has the same problem that the idealist has. He cannot escape his own subjectivity. He will never experience the thought or feeling of another person, ever. So that's why philosophy puts some effort, like, okay, we've got some work to do. Let's use some reasoning, right? Let's use some reasoning. We can never experience the thoughts and feelings, but we can figure out that they must be thinking and feeling. See that? We're going to figure it out. Kind of like we know that this thing is made of electrons. Electrons are too small to really be seen in microscopes. So you can come up with a whole bunch of data and analyze the data and look at patterns, and you can make an educated guess called a hypothesis. And you can say, okay, we can never see electrons, but we can develop good reasons to believe that there are electrons. You see that? So also the philosopher can develop good reasons to say that I'm not the only mind in the universe. And that's what this argument from analogy is. So how does Bertrand Russell set us all up to see this? Well, he starts with the obvious. We are at least familiar with some minds. Each of us is familiar with our own mind, right? We know that we have minds because we experience our thoughts, our feelings, our beliefs, our desires, etc. Pain, pleasure, all of that. We feel it. But we deny that chairs or stones or buildings have that kind of thing. We deny that typically. But this is a philosophy class, so let's start right there. Let's drop a little footnote. Why do we deny it? Guys, philosophers think crazy things. There's a wide and growing movement called panpsychism, which actually believes that everything in the universe has some mental qualities. Not all of them have the same, clarity and distinctness of their thoughts and feelings. But literally a philosopher like Leibniz or Wilhelm Wundt or others, they actually believe that everything in the world has some mind in it, everything. So I want to know what you think. Like, why do we typically treat inanimate objects as if they are inanimate? By the way, what does inanimate mean? Well, an animal is something that has a soul, a particular kind of soul. That's what anima in Latin means soul. In Greek, it means psyche. So psychology presupposes something like a soul. Now, current academic and professional philosophy probably doesn't, right? If they want to measure everything and they're materialists. So they might call themselves psychologists, but they probably don't believe in the soul. But I want to suggest to you that the burden is still preserved, the burden of, what is the soul and what explains how experience is possible, that is still there. So what I'm asking you is this. We know that we have minds and we have some familiarity with what a mind is, but we tend to deny that status of having a mind to some objects in the world, but not to others. So at the level of just a common sense, naive, intuitive level of understanding things, right? At that level, why do we pick and choose? What is it about a chair where we just dismiss it, and then another person we're eager to affirm their animate status? These are obviously inanimate objects, but Chris and Dante and Sarah, those are animate. Why? Why do we have that prejudice? What could possibly justify that prejudice? Yes, go ahead. Sorry, what? Oh, because they use tools.
You can see this as a tool.
Oh, equipment. It's like equipment, yeah. Okay, good.
That's its own purpose. It was made for that.
Okay, good, okay. Yeah, these are artificial things, but I'm gonna throw a monkey wrench in that. Okay, let's take a stone. You're going hiking and you come across a beautiful, I don't know, marble or quartz or whatever, sandstone, something. Now, that's not artificial. It doesn't look like it was designed for something, yet it would still be in the same category as this under the title inanimate, right? Tell us more.
About the soul?
Yeah, because you said this is inanimate because it's artificial. And I granted you that, although it's going to get tricky when we come to AI, right?
Yeah.
And computers. But let's put the AI case aside. Not all artificial things are the same. But let's put artificial things aside. What about a rock? People call that inanimate too. In virtue of what do they call it inanimate? Just think about animals, guys. That's the clue. So they're called animals. There are two qualities that I can see in almost all animals that would make me think, there's something more going on here. There's some soul here. These things are animate. They have some soul. Think about two qualities that soul typically gives you. Sorry, what? Yes, very good. Movement. Very good. That's what Aristotle saw. The soul typically animates things, and that's why you call them animals. Plants don't have that, inanimate things don't have that. We have that, so we're a kind of animal, but we've got something else going on as well. We reason. We have the capacity to reason. So in addition to movement, there's one other thing, guys. Animals also have what? Look at our anatomy. There's movement, but what do we have that plants don't have? We can move, plants don't move, but we can also do something else that it doesn't seem like plants can do. Think about your anatomy. Nutrition? No, we both do nutrition. Plants and animals both have nutrition. Look at your anatomy. If you look in the mirror, what do you see that plants don't have? I mean, they've got their own kinds of organs. They're not analogous to ours. It's something so simple that when I say it, you're going to laugh. Yeah, senses, right? We don't think that plants have senses the same way we do. So Aristotle, like 2,300 years ago, when he's classifying different biological species, yeah, with the animals, he's saying, look, there's the presence of soul, and what can soul do that matter can't? You should know the answer to this by now, guys. Activity, right? Matter is inert. Newton said that. Newton said his first law is that inertia, right? All matter is inert. What does that mean? It can't move itself. You see that? All objects will remain at rest or in motion at a constant velocity unless acted upon by an external force, a net external force. That is Newton's first law. Inanimate objects, not only do they not start themselves to move, they actually offer up a bit of resistance because of their mass. And that sluggishness is called inertia, that laziness, that torpidity, that slothfulness, that tendency to not want to move until you apply a force. That is inertia. And that's what Aristotle was detecting, like, 2,000 years before Newton. He's saying, look, wherever there is life, there's energy, there's force. And soul is the only hypothesis that can explain that kind of force. So what do we have, guys? We have one kind of activity, which is pure local motion, moving things. But what is the other kind of activity that we talked about last class? There's another kind of activity, apart from getting things moving, that we talked about, and that is very important. It's the basis of your subjectivity. It's not motion, it's something else. What is it that gives everything around you the status of ideas? It's something you're doing, something that your soul is doing, your mind is doing constantly. Yes, very good, it's thinking. And one particular aspect of that thinking, which is an activity, right, is perception. You're constantly perceptive. Even when you dream, you're still perceiving. You are the kind of thing, according to Descartes, you are the kind of thing that cannot stop thinking. Even when you dream, even when you sleep, you must think. Dreaming is a kind of thinking. If you stop thinking, then you would stop existing, according to Descartes. The reason I'm bringing this up, guys, is because if we look at the entire field of what we're presented with, the first starting point is why do we deny certain objects the status of having soul or mind, thought, feeling, beliefs, desire. This is a burden. I want you to feel that burden. They're not going to raise this in a physics class. And the burden is the following. Even after Newton introduced inertia into objects like this, fine. So maybe there isn't an individual mind here in the same way that we have a mind. But guys, think carefully about what gravity is. Think deeply about what gravity is. We tend to associate gravity with physics, and there are certain equations that measure relationships between mass and acceleration and all that, and we get complacent. We're like, yeah, the scientists figured it all out, and it's obvious that matter is inanimate. But what did we just say? Didn't we say that one of the properties of soul is to animate? So if a force like gravity attracts masses together, we could speak of that as a kind of animation. Do you see what I'm saying? In other words, the philosopher is going to be a bit slothful. He's going to be a bit more resistant to the idea that it's obvious that inanimate things have no soul. Leibniz thought that the world was saturated with soul. Leibniz was a Christian, and I think his logic goes something like this. Whatever God is, omnipotent, omniscient, whatever, one quality that God must have is that he must be pure soul. He must be full of soul. Why would Leibniz be committed to this? Because he associates soul with energy, vitality, life. So whatever God is, he's full of life. But if he creates a world in his image, then what is the world going to be full of? You see the logic? It's going to be full of life. So Leibniz thought this right here is full of soul, energy, spirit, matter, life. Everything is full of, saturated with life. In fact, Leibniz is an idealist, so technically, kind of like Berkeley, he doesn't even believe matter technically exists. But even to the extent that it does, it's just full and full and full of life. Microbes, he thinks there are no atoms, so the further down you go, you'll just find more and more creatures that are animated by different forces. But they're creatures the same way we were creatures. There's mind there. So if you hold on to the hypothesis that wherever there is gravity, there is mind, I think you're going to throw a monkey wrench in the typical physicist's theory of the world. But of course, the physicist is going to dismiss the anthropologist and be like, any culture that believes inanimate things have a soul is a primitive culture, right? Now, let's go back to the problem of other minds. So even if the physicist denies that this chair is animated by a force to move it, he could get out of that. But how could the physicist ever prove or disprove that there's perception going on in the chair? How would you overcome that burden? Because it's the same burden that he has with you guys. If he can overcome that burden, then he can overcome it with you. You see that? If he can overcome the burden of showing that this thing has mind, then he can do it with you. He'll just do an analogous move. Oh my God, we have 9 minutes. Okay, here's what's going on, guys. Okay. Here's the idea. The one mind I'm sure of is my own. Now here's the key, the essence. There is a relationship between my behavior of my body and my thoughts and my feelings. Whenever I have a certain thought or feeling, I typically tend to see it associated with a certain bodily behavior. You see that? When I'm thirsty, I tend to say things like, man, I would love a root beer right now. Or, man, I was out in the sun all day. I am just thirsty as hell. You tend to say things like that. Now, those sayings and those doings are behaviors of your body. Do you see that? And it's natural to assume that it's the thoughts or the feelings that are causing that behavior. Do you see that? So we have A causes B. A, I know because it's in my own mind, and B, I see because I see it in my body. You see that? Okay. So you have access to A, you have access to B, and you also see the relationship between A and B in a causal connection. One causes the other. Now, look out. Get out of yourself and now look around you. Over time, with these classmates of yours and these other people, you will get access to one thing. What is the one thing you'll have access to? You have A, B, and the relationship between B. That's what you have access to on your own terms. But as you look at your classmates and your family and your friends, you don't have all that. You only have one thing. You only have B. You only have the behavior part. You see that? So, how can I go from something that I observe in their body and infer or conclude something that I don't see in their body, something that I assume must be going on in their mind or soul? Do you see the problem now? And do you see the argumentative structure? The argumentative structure is going to be something like, well, whenever I show B, I typically feel A. I'm seeing B, but I'm not feeling it myself right now. I'm seeing it in another body, so I assume that that other body also has some A. Do you see that? Is this making sense, guys? This is a type of argument. Remember I said there were two types of arguments? This is one type of argument. What kind of argument is this? Argument by what? Yeah, what were the two different types of argument? Deductive and inductive. Now, one of those had three different categories. Do you remember which one? Yeah, inductive, right. Inductive had three subdivisions. Which subdivision corresponds to the kind of reasoning we're doing right now? Not quite. Try again. You're on the right track. Enumerative would be, I see 5 zebras in my life. That's my sample size. And somehow, from the 5 zebras, I conclude that since every zebra I've seen has stripes, what? They all do. That's enumerative. But we're looking for something slightly different. The one we're doing is this. I see 2 objects that share certain properties. Let's say out of all the properties they share 5 properties. So the 2 objects share 5 properties, right? So then you leap and you say, well, since they share 5, they must share all. You see that? Do you remember which type of reasoning that was? Okay, let me put it this way. Let me put it this way. Whenever you're reasoning about one thing and you use another thing independently to help you figure out this thing, what are you doing? You're making a what? Comparison? Yes, it's a comparison. There's a technical name for it. Analogy. You've heard of the word analogy? You're making an analogy. The type of reasoning we're doing is analogical reasoning. It's a kind of inductive reasoning. Do you see that? You see why it's inductive? It's because, guys, the premises that you have are not strong enough to imply the conclusion necessarily. But they do kind of support it. Do you see that? So in a deductive argument, when you say all men are mortal and Socrates is a man, well, then it follows necessarily. There is no alternative. Socrates must be mortal. But if you have what we have right here, which is we have one object shares properties with another, so we assume that since they share certain properties, they must share others. Now we're reaching a bit. It doesn't follow necessarily. They could fail to share all those other properties. You see that? We're reaching. So guys, this is the kind of reasoning basically that Bertrand Russell is talking about there. I mean, we don't even have to spend a lot of time on it. We can go ahead and conclude. What are we basically saying? Well, we're saying that I can only see my classmates' bodies. I can never feel their feelings or think their thoughts. Now, I just want to pause there, a little footnote. Guys, what is empathy? Isn't it a kind of feeling someone else's feelings? But that gets metaphysical, right? And the physicists aren't going to like it. They're going to say, how can you say you're feeling her feelings? Are you some sort of psychic or clairvoyant? You know, they're going to diss you. So I just want to leave that open as a possibility. Maybe we are the kinds of beings that can intuit through intuition. We can intuit other people's feelings directly. Maybe. But you might wind up like Sadie if you go down that road. You see why? All right, guys, I'm going to take attendance.